Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Dove. I'm the Executive Director of the Davidson Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at Bentley University. This is the 8th event in our new series of 10 book conversations, academic innovation, and the public good. These are ongoing dialogues with authors about how education can innovate in ways that are informed, humane, and rooted. Bentley University is a co-sponsor of this series, along with 16 other higher education institutions that are listed in the slide you see here. This series is organized by Stanford Digital Education and Trinity College. Additional partners include the Stanford Humanities Center Recovering the University as a Public Good initiative and the Stanford Pathways Lab. Each event features a prominent author of a new book in the field in conversation with an expert colleague about their work. For a full list of participating authors and interviewers, please visit the event calendar, which is linked in the Zoom chat. At the end of tonight's event, we hope to see you all in our community space at ai4pg.gatherlearning.com for a continued discussion of the book's theme, an honest conversation and confrontation of systemic racism in faculty hiring and what to do about it. We'll put a link in the conversation space in the chat as well. You'll have the chance to talk with others about Marybeth's ideas on issues surrounding the recruitment and hiring of faculty of color. For those who want to grab a copy of Marybeth's book, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. The link is also in the chat, and a limited number of signed copies will be available. With that, I am pleased to introduce Marybeth Gasman, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair in Education and a distinguished professor. She also serves as Associate Dean for Research in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University, as well as the Executive Director of both the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, and the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. In addition, Marybeth is in her second year as chair of the Faculty Council at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her book, Doing the Right Thing: How Colleges and Universities Can Undo Systemic Racism in Faculty Hiring, documents the institutional forces stymieing faculty diversification and explores how such deficiencies can be rectified. She will be interviewed tonight by Marybeth Castaneda, Professor of Communication and Dean of Commonwealth Honors College at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Thank you for joining us tonight, Marybeth and Marty. I'm very grateful to both of you for being part of this series. And before I turn the floor over to Marty, I just want to briefly cover the format of tonight's program. So following the conclusion of the author conversation, we'll open the floor to audience questions. If you would like to submit a question during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will monitor the Q&A for instances of inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, we will remove users from the event. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I am happy to turn it over to Marty.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It is wonderful to be here with everyone, especially with Marybeth. I am so looking forward to our conversation and dialogue and the Q&A that will be happening later on this afternoon. And I just wanted to, of course, plug the book. If everyone, hasn't received it yet or bought it, please, please, please really recommend getting it, because it's absolutely fabulous and so needed in this point in time. Before we actually get started, we would love to do a poll so that we can get a pulse of where folks are at and their experiences with regard to this important topic that we're going to be discussing here today. So the question is, have you witnessed systemic racism in faculty hiring at your institution or others? And the response is a simple yes or no. So we would love for folks to participate, and we will go back to those poll results once we've begun the conversation. So Marybeth, again, welcome being here. I'm so excited. So of course, the first question, and simple question, but very important question, is why this book and why now?
Sure. It's a great question. It's kind of an oddly complicated question. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, oh, you decided to write this book because of all the things that are going on. But I actually decided to write this book quite a while ago. And what happened is in 2016, I attended and was a speaker at the New York Times Higher Education Forum. And I was sitting on stage with Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, although she was not that well known at the time. I mean, she was an amazing reporter, of course, and journalist, but she hadn't sort of blown up at the time yet, right? So I was on the stage with her, and I was there to talk about minority serving institutions, which is what I talk about most of the time. And she, for some reason, she asked me a question, and she said, Marybeth, why is it that we don't have more diversity in the faculty at predominantly white institutions, especially highly selective institutions that are research oriented? And I just looked at her, and I looked out at the audience, which was really a majority white audience, very kind of highly influential audience. And I thought, you know what, this is the time. And I said, because we don't want them. And then she said, what do you mean? I said, because if we wanted to have a diverse faculty, we know exactly what to do. There have been handbooks written, there's been research done. Faculty of color and people of color have been championing these causes for a long time, but we don't do anything. We don't do anything about it. And so that happened. And then I was at a cocktail party that evening, and this journalist from the Hechinger Report comes up to me, and she said, I like what you said. And by the way, I got a standing ovation after I said that at that event, right? And she walks up to me and she says, I like what you said. Would you put it in writing? And I said, sure, because I write a lot of op-eds, right? So I put it in writing, and I got maybe 600 emails as a result of it, right? So then what happened is the Washington Post contacted her and said, can we reprint this? And they decided, I was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, they decided to say, to title it, an Ivy League professor says the reason why we don't have more faculty of color is because we don't want them, which is clickbait. But when you open it up, you found out all the reasons why I thought that we show that we don't want them, right? All of these reasons rooted in systemic racism. So what ended up happening is I got roughly 7,000 emails as a result of that Washington Post op-ed, and which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but I couldn't even believe it. I mean, it just went crazy. It was all over the place. In fact, it was posted the other day again, and people thought it was a new article, So I actually ended up talking to Princeton University Press because they asked me, do you have any ideas for books? And I said, well, this is something I've been thinking about. I have all this information and I care about this, but it's not really an area where I've written extensively before. And so I started doing some research and started reading everything, which I'll, allude to more later too. But all of that happened before George Floyd was murdered, right? Mm-hmm. And so I had written the entire book before then. And when George Floyd was murdered, I had to go back and do a rewrite of the entire book because I didn't rewrite it substantially, but I had to couch it a little bit differently because many of the things that I was talking about needed greater context. And so the Why Now book is, I didn't really write it for right now, the now that we're in. I wrote it for the now that we were in 2016. And I wrote it between 2016 and 2021, really. So you never know. I mean, I literally was changing it nonstop because you know what happened during COVID and during those times, right? Things were just changing like rapidly. And so rapidly that I just kept having to change it over and over and over. And, you know, once it went into production, I couldn't change it anymore. So, so you get what you get. But
Well,
that is that.
I was just going to say that the relevance continues, right?
Yeah.
The relevance continues of the topic, that it's something that, as you noted, folks have been conducting research and have been doing this work for a long time, and yet the changes haven't happened.
Not at all.
Exactly. And so it definitely felt like that particular moment, especially everyone started talking about also the impact of systemic racism on communities of color, and not just in academia, but across the board. And so folks really had the language to have that conversation. And so I wanted to actually bring up the results to see how folks have actually, so yes. So the question to, have you witnessed systemic racism, faculty hiring at your institution and others? And of course, the others is not just your institution, but probably other places as well outside of academia also. How have you experienced it? And we could see the majority is saying yes. So, I mean, that definitely points to the fact that, again, the book is necessary, it's needed, folks have witnessed it. And so what do we do about it? How do we address this? But before we get to that kind of conversation, I would love for you to share more about, how did you do the research for the book? Who did you talk to? Because I have to say, I was struck by the candidness of so many folks in your book. And it was amazing to see folks' willingness to speak to you honestly about what they were seeing at their institutions, in their roles, and very important roles in deciding and being a big part of faculty hiring at various different universities. And so I was really fascinated by that and wanted to hear more about how you conducted that research. Because often at times, honestly, these kinds of very honest conversations, truth to power, a lot of folks don't always feel comfortable being able to share, but they shared and opened with you.
They did.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really good question. And one thing I was going to say is that, you know, one of the reasons why I decided to write this book is because, quite frankly, I felt sort of mad as hell. I just at all of the systemic racism in hiring that I had seen over the years. I just felt, at that moment when she asked me that question on stage, I was like, oh. And then the interesting thing is, a lot of the people that I talked to, and it had read that Washington Post piece, so I was surprised they were so candid too. So I'll explain a little bit about some of the things that I did. So one thing I wanted to say is that one thing I have noticed over the years is, if you are trying to get through to faculty, if they don't want to accept what you have to say, they will immediately go after the methodology and they will tear it to shreds, okay? And so, and this is, I'm saying this as a faculty member and somebody who loves being a faculty member. And so one thing I said to myself is, I'm going to make this as data rich as I possibly can. And so I did both qualitative interviews. I did over 100 qualitative interviews with provosts, deans, diversity deans, department chairs, search committee chairs. And I also use data from the survey of earned doctorates. I use data from the National Center for Educational Statistics. I use Twitter. I analyze Twitter feeds. I talked to experts. I read extensively across all disciplines that were doing this work. And here's the thing. This is how I got people to talk to me. I had to make them 100% anonymous. I had to, for any person of color, I tended to have to mask their race and gender. I had to switch them around because there are so few people at the, and you know, I did work related to the AAU institutions. So you know, some of the most highly selective research intensive institutions, the 63 of them that I looked at in the book. And there aren't a lot of people of color in leadership positions. And so I had to mask people. The other thing is that once people knew they were masked, and I will say a lot of people just told me what was on their mind. They said things that I would never have believed that they would say, especially given that I had written that article, right? So now, of course, I never revealed anyone. I didn't reveal an institution. I kept that I kept that promise, right? And I never will. In fact, you can't tell which of the AAUs I talked to and which ones I didn't, because that would even give things away, right? So that's how I did that, and people just felt really comfortable. I will tell you another thing, that is a lot of books. There are lots of books about, systemic racism and diversity and hiring and things like that, and I cite some of them that I think are fantastic, but there are others that are kind of wonkish, okay? So they don't talk to people in language like you and I are talking right now. And the only way I feel like you can get at these issues is if we just talk about them, like we're talking over coffee. And that's how I wrote the book. I wrote it like you and I were talking over coffee, and we were trying to figure out how to solve a problem. And to me, that was really important.
Well, and the other thing that's related to that, that it also felt that folks wanted to talk, right? So the fact that folks were so honest and sharing about their experiences and what they've witnessed as well, it really felt like there's also a moment that folks are feeling like that we need to talk about this, even when it's not necessarily very pretty, or the things that we're witnessing. And so what is it that, with regards to the work that you did, the findings that shocked you or surprised you that that emerged from the work that you were conducting in the interviews and all the various different research sets that you were looking at?
So I actually really love that question of what shocks me, because I felt like I wouldn't be shocked by what I heard, but I was. And I'll tell you, one of the things that really shocked me was just how candidly and openly people accepted systemic racism and acted as if there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. And so that was one thing. I thought, my gosh, how are you just sitting there not doing anything about it when you know it exists? And then another thing that sort of shocked me was how often candidates of color were blamed for their not being hired. So people would say, well, they'd never take this job, we can't afford them, and they won't be happy here. So rather than taking institutional responsibility, what would happen is they would blame the candidate, right? So, and Joanne Moody wrote a book that talks about that whole idea, which I cite in the book because I found it so interesting. Another thing that I wasn't shocked by this, but I really think it's important to say, and that is that most people I talked to at these AAU institutions told me they hire from 5 to 7 institutions max. And that the number one and number two things that they consider when hiring people are who was your advisor and where you got your PhD. And that was not trumped by what you had done. Those were the number one and number two. And think about that, 5 to 7 institutions. And then I think another thing that was really troubling was all the excuses that they just brought up, the same ones, right? We can't afford them, they won't come here, they're not in the pipeline. They had no data, there's no data, but those just kept coming up. And then the last thing that I want to say, and I just really want to emphasize this is so important, and that is that, so I did analysis of the pipeline as well as who's in the academy now. And what I found is that African Americans specifically are not earning enough degrees at AAU institutions. And let me tell you why that's a problem, because the people getting jobs at the high intensive research institutions are coming from AAU institutions. So African Americans, and actually the Latinx population would be next, are basically in a situation where they're getting PhDs, but not at the AAUs, and thus they're not getting hired at the AAU institutions, at the most selective, high research institutions. And so this is just a cycle that won't stop until you can stop that pattern at the, in the pipeline as well. So that's something I think is pretty devastating in the data. There's a whole bunch of other really devastating things too, but those are some devastating things to me.
And I wanted to note that actually that reinforced when I read that in your work in the book, what I had experienced myself as well, and what I had heard from faculty also through search committees, and the impact that that has in terms of the kind of research and the cultural, the kind of knowledge production that gets impacted is also a really big loss that we end up experiencing as a result of focusing on certain institutions and focusing on certain advisors and so forth that end up reproducing themselves, even as newer generations come to the fore, end up reproducing that. So can you share a little bit more about and expand a little bit more about this issue of quality and pedigree that you found in the research that you were conducting for the book? Because I feel like that is such an important thing that really needs to be addressed.
Sure, absolutely. And I do want to say that in my discussion of pedigree, I really relied on Lauren Rivera's work. She has this amazing book called Pedigree. It's also published by Princeton. I would recommend picking it up in a second. I learned so much from reading that book. So, and I just want to read a short passage from the book because I think it's really important here. So this is about something that happened to me. So in the book I write, a professor asked me the following question. Architects are in the business of producing buildings. Plausibly, what's most important is that we have the best producers of buildings, not that the producers be diverse. Plausibly, professors are in the business of producing knowledge. Why not care about having the best producers of knowledge? And if they happen to be white, so be it. So I responded by saying, I would argue that we won't know our potential for producing the best buildings, the most beautiful and impressive buildings, unless we are inclusive about who has the opportunity to produce these buildings. If we are more inclusive, we may even expand our definitions and understandings of the best and the most beautiful and the most impressive buildings. Likewise, I would argue that we don't truly know who the best producers of knowledge are if we aren't inclusive about who has the opportunity to produce knowledge. If we are more inclusive, we may even expand our definitions of the best in terms of the production of knowledge. And so I think, and I realize this will make some people angry, but we have a narrow construction of merit and quality that was designed by white men for white men. And so, for me, in looking at issues of quality, as I said, I really relied on Lauren Rivera. And I want to note a couple of things that she says. She talks about how merit is ever evolving. It's a moving target, and it's shaped by those who have power in a given society. And the definitions of merit tend to reflect the values and qualities of those in power. And so she also talks about how, and again, this might make some folks mad, but I just want you to think about it, how many times elites can rig the criteria in their favor to preserve their privilege for themselves and also their children and keep members out who they find threatening. And then the last thing that I think is so important that she says is that we tend to define merit and quality in our own image. And what she says is, ask anyone, regardless of their social class, what constitutes a good student, a good parent, or even a good driver. And typically what happens is they'll describe somebody like themselves. And so these things were really, really powerful to me, as well as the idea that elite folks who hold power usually set the rules of the game. So it's not surprising when merit is defined or measured in society, so that elites have more of it. And that's why we need to reconstruct these kinds of things with the voices of people of color in the process of reconstructing it, because it was created for white men by white men. And I think we just have to own up to that. And I think that's okay to own up to. It's time we reconstructed some of these things.
I absolutely agree. I think that the challenge is, how do we do that, right? And how do we get other folks to buy into the importance of having to do that? And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, well, what can leaders do to actually get the buy-in of folks to both recognize it, and it's okay to recognize it, and then also address it so that we're not reproducing the same thing that we have reproduced over time, as well. So I was wondering if, in your research, what did people say about what can be done and what leaders can role? Because I think really leaders are really important in sort of setting the, if not the agenda per se, certainly the framework, the pathway, the sort of larger context that then allows faculty and search committees to do something different than what they've always done as well.
Yeah, and I would also love to hear your thoughts, because you are in a leadership position that can make change, right? So a couple things I will say is I have an entire chapter in the book that is a call to action that gives like step by step of things that people can do. So I try to be really practical. I'm definitely one of these scholars who likes to be practical. So
thank goodness. I think we need more of that.
Thank you. So here's a couple things. These are easy. These are just easy things that leaders can do. Confront those common excuses immediately. Just if they come up, don't let them stand, right? Just say, that's not going to work here. And we're not going to use those as excuses. We're going to come up, we're going to go ahead. Even if you think that, let's just move ahead. And constantly do that. And I would say, even if you're not a leader, if you're, just a faculty member, hopefully we're all leaders, but a faculty member, you can do exactly the same thing. Another thing that you have to do is you have to bring up the importance of this in every setting that you can. So don't make it just around hiring when you're bringing in faculty. Bring it up at the beginning of the year, bring it up in orientation, bring it up in laud the diverse faculty and how important that is during graduation. Do it during faculty meetings. One of the things I really love about my own dean, Wanda Blanchette at Rutgers, is she does it 24/7. I mean, she just talks about it 24/7 and just puts it out there. It's really important.
What is she saying specifically? Like
what she's saying is that this is what we value. This is how we're going to operate. And you're either gonna come along, or you can get along, right? And I think that's a lot of the people who were successful, who I talked to in the book, that was their attitude. Another thing, this is a really practical thing you can do. If you're a dean or a provost, you can tell search committees, first of all, it's a requirement to look at pipeline data. And your pool and your final candidates need to be a reflection of that pipeline data. So if the pipeline data is diverse, I need your pool to be diverse. If it's not so diverse, I need you to work extra hard, to bring in people. And I need you, here's another thing, require people to do the research around faculty hiring. As scholars, we do research all the time, but for some reason, we can't seem to figure out how to do the research, even though it's out there around faculty hiring. So require people to figure out, where do I look for candidates of color? And how do I make sure that candidates of color feel comfortable? Another thing is, this one will, again, make people mad, but I tell you, some of the most successful people, here's what they do. If a department keeps bringing in white people over and over and over, they stop the searches. They're like, nope, you're all white. You're not, this especially has happened in like physics and engineering and philosophy, which are not as diverse. You're all white every single year. Nope, you can't do that. It's going to stop. And when that happened to the people who I talked to in my book, when these deans did that, guess what? The next year, guess what happened?
They made a difference. They
brought in a person of color. And the following year, they brought in a person of color because they realized, there are talented people of color out there who could do that. And then the last thing I would say for leaders is, I think if you're a provost, it's a great idea to put in the performance review of deans. And if you're a dean, put in the performance review of chairs, that they're responsible for these things, that these are important, and that they need to get on board. Now, I did have some folks who told me, I don't even need to put it in the performance review. If you're not going to do it, you're out, right? But I do think that most people had the best luck by putting it in the performance review.
And I think you're absolutely right. It's about the intentionality that makes a big difference in how we operate in these spaces. And I did want to share that in my own work in the past, I was also working very closely with search committees at my institution at UMass Amherst. And that was one of the things that was really important. What's the pipeline data? What does the pool look like? How is this ultimate, not only pool that we're bringing to campus, but the finalist pool, but also even the bigger pool? How does that reflect? And if it's not, let's continue looking, let's continue making sure we're reaching out to other colleagues. And there really has to be a really good reason why it's not reflecting that. What are we missing? Who are we not talking to? And it really did make a big difference, but it did require the effort of those committees and the faculty. And so relatedly, what else can search committees do to also address this issue? Because I think that that's the place where a lot of this discussion is taking place, and the place that ultimately is sort of making those kinds of decisions. Of course, you have the provost and the dean participating, but on the ground in terms of ultimately sort of who are the folks that are looking at these applications, reaching out to colleagues, doing that 5 or 7 institutions, right, as opposed to expanding the pool. What else can they possibly do given the work that you did?
Sure. And so I'll say another thing that might not make me that popular, but I know this because I have an essay coming out, and the editor of it, she said, "Woo, you're not going to be very popular saying this." But okay, I'm saying this as someone who's chair of a faculty council, right? This is a shared governance issue. This is, faculty are always talking about shared governance, but when it comes to hiring like a diverse faculty, I don't think they're doing enough. And so for me, this is a shared governance issue. And so a couple things I'm going to repeat. When the excuses come up, you've got to say something. You can't let those fly on the search committee. Another thing you can do is you've got to share the opportunities widely. And in the book, I talk about like known networks. Most faculty share with just the people that they know. So what you've got to do is you've got to do a little research. All you got to do, you can use Google in a second to figure out who's producing, more PhDs in engineering who are African American or Latinx. You can figure out who's producing Black women in physics, right? I can tell you that in a second, right? So you can Google that pretty quickly, and you need to do some reaching out. You need to do some talking to people. You need to, pull yourself onto social media and push out and, get people to help you to do that. You need to advertise widely. You can't just call up people That's really important. I think here's another thing, groupthink. This happens in search committees. If everybody's just sort of going along and you're not getting a diverse pool, you got to speak up. And honestly, most people on search committees are tenured. What do you honestly have to lose? Right? I mean, it's
amazing how folks don't.
Yes. So you want to speak up in that. Another thing I would say is, don't get mad when someone asks you to take implicit bias training. It's a good thing. And I'll tell you something, I wrote this whole book, but I still participated in implicit bias training prior to doing a search this year. And I learned so much during that implicit bias training. And I was really excited because it was being conducted by a white male in science. And I thought, whoever decided that was so smart, because he was incredibly effective as well. And I think, they have the teams of people doing it at Rutgers, and it's great. And a lot of people would say to me, why would you do that when you wrote this book? Because I always have things to learn. We all do. And I think you never know what you're going to learn. So being very open to that is important. And then the last thing I would say is, when you're looking at the final candidate pool, like the people you're going to invite to campus, think to yourself, are they representative of the overall pool? Do they fit the job description, or did somebody just recommend them? Are they here because they're highly qualified person for the job, or is it because who their advisor was and where they went to, where they got their PhD? If you find yourself saying something like this, well, they haven't produced that much, but they've got a great advisor, and all that advisor's students do well. No, well, what if you have a person of color who's produced a lot, but maybe doesn't have as famous of an advisor, but has a great track record? What are we doing here, right? We're perpetuating that privilege, and so those are just a few things. I have hundreds of things that I wrote about as ideas in the book, but I'm just trying to give you a few ideas.
Yeah, and I think actually you're pointing to some of the practices that I think other institutions are starting to slowly institute and have. For instance, the one you just described, we've done that at UMass as well. And it really has made a big difference, because also these kinds of conversations and leading, for instance, an implicit bias workshop shouldn't just be on the backs of, folks of color. Like it should be something that everyone buys into, that everyone believes is important and is a value for our institution and for our colleagues, to be able to understand and know and reflect on when is this happening and when is this taking place. So we have another poll that we would love to have our audience participate in, because I do feel like this is an important question related to how do we make sure that folks feel they're able to address these issues. So the question for the poll is, do you feel equipped to do the work to dismantle systemic racism in faculty hiring? So do you feel equipped to do the work to dismantle systemic racism in faculty hiring? Because I think that that's an important piece to reflect on, and for a question for folks. And I think it would be great to hear, to see very simply yes or no, whether folks really have that, because that's, I think, is what's going to take to address that. So another question that I had, because I think that there are bigger issues here that we're really trying to get to, is what should be the sort of highest priorities that colleges and universities should seek to advance higher education for the public good, and particularly with regard to this issue of faculty diversity. What can we do, and what can innovation and creativity, contribute to these efforts? You already pointed to several that are innovative practices that institutions can adopt and so forth. But what else can be sort of imagined or reimagined with regards to the highest priorities that we should really institutionalize?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. And I guess I'm going to say one thing before even giving suggestions, is that I don't think colleges or universities should be boasting about being excellent like they do everywhere in every mission statement without having a diverse faculty. And I really think that it's imperative that students learn from a wide array of individuals, and that a wide array of individuals have the opportunity to teach students. I think that is a public good. And, I feel like we have so much evidence that diversity sparks innovation. Why wouldn't we want all of this diversity within higher education? I mean, we have it. And I show in the book that we actually have it even at these highly selective, research intensive universities. We have it at the student level. But why is it that we have such resistance at the faculty level? And, I think we know that diversity brings innovation, it brings creativity, it brings new ideas. And I also think, and again, maybe not so popular, but having a diverse faculty or a diverse staff or diverse students keeps you honest. And it also keeps you on track for creating opportunity for everyone and not just some people. So I wanted to say that before I gave like just kind of a, here's how you do it. And I'm just going to give you one thing just so we can get to questions. But I just wanted to say that because I think it's really important. And then here's something that is a response to an excuse that I think works, right? One of the excuses is there's no pipeline. So my response to that is, okay, all right, so create a pipeline. Right? Create a pipeline. There is absolutely no reason why 5 to 6 institutions couldn't get together and say to each other, okay, let's make sure that we all bring in a very diverse PhD group. And if you can't bring that in, then you're going to need to start with the undergrads, right? And you're going to need to create that pipeline. Let's say, let's all decide we're going to do that. And then let's also look to each other for future faculty candidates. I mean, I don't like the insularness of that, but if you're not willing to go beyond 5 institutions, you still could do it with your 5 institutions, I mean, I don't want to see people do that, because I really want to see people to broaden definitions of quality and not be stuck in these narrow definitions that I'm not even sure how they're defined. I'm not even sure what they mean. So for me, until we do that, I don't see us serving the public good. Not that we don't do, colleges and universities do amazing things for the public good, but we've got to get over this hurdle. I mean, this is the fact that the faculty in the in the US is still like slightly over 70% white is troubling, right? That's troubling. And at these AAU institutions, it's higher. So
Marybeth, I was wondering, so why don't people do more if they know the problem exists? I mean, why isn't this effort sort of really recognize it and doing more to address it than if we know it? What do you think is some of those challenges?
Okay, again, I'm not going to be popular for saying this, but quite frankly, I think people are lazy. And I noticed that Daryl Smith is on here, and she's someone who I really, really engaged with her work. And I also interviewed her for the book because she's just done, an enormous amount of work. And I'll tell you, one of the things that she talked to me about, which I love this example, is she said, I know exercise is good for me, but sometimes in the afternoon, after a long day, I just don't do it, even though I know that the results are great and that it just helps me overall and that it's a good thing. I know it's the right thing to do, but sometimes I just don't do it. And she used that analogy, she used that as an example for me to sort of understand the whole reason why faculty don't do these things. I think that we're not academically lazy when it comes to doing our research. But I think that we claim to not know how to hire a diverse faculty, and all we would have to do was do some research, would be to ask people who are successful, and to just learn how to use Google. Learn how to use the library search feature. And I'm kind of joking here, right? Because we of course know how to do that. But we're sort of lazy about it. And when I was writing this book, I had a bunch of people read it before I sent it to my editor at Princeton. And one person said, "Well, I don't think you should put lazy in there. Faculty are going to get really mad at you." And I said, "No, I took it out for like a day. And then I put it back in because it is laziness. It is laziness." And I also think so that's the kind way of looking at it. Okay. Mm-hmm. The not so kind way of looking at it is to say that we only think we have so much opportunity and we don't want other people to have a slice of the pie. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that if we bring in a more diverse faculty, white folks are going to have to give up a little because we've had too much. We have to create opportunities for people. We have to share. We have to, we have to make room. We have to make room. It's the same thing we tell kids, we got to make room. And I think there are a lot of people that don't like that. They don't want to give anything up. They don't want to share. They like it the way that it is. And so, I hate to say it, but that's where the systemic racism comes in. We just sort of keep it for ourselves. And I don't think that's right. And I don't think that would be in the interest of the public good or in the interest of our students.
Absolutely. And in fact, I would love to show the results from the poll and also encourage folks to please post on the Q&A function to be able to engage in a dialogue and conversation and questions. So yeah, see, that's the thing. So the opposite, where people do not feel that they're equipped to be able to do that. And I think that's the role that institutions really need to play to be able to equip folks. Your book being a really important, book reading of everyone reading it together, for instance. But I think that there's other things that folks can do to also get equipped to address this issue of systemic racism and the impact that has, not only in hiring, but we're going to see that in a variety of policies, practices, cultural practices, the way we teach in the classroom. There's so many other ways in which this gets also played out. That is not only related to faculty hiring, but also with the ways in which how the institution as a whole feels for not only white colleagues and students and staff, but also for faculty of color and students of color as well. What kind of institution are we creating? So we do have a question here and that I wanted to pose to you. Thank you so much, Marybeth. I'm just like, sometimes I'm just so engaged and both in your excitement, but also the urgency that you're demonstrating, because you're right, it's an urgent situation that we really need to be addressing right now. So you wrote a spectacular book.
Thank you.
And that, in my opinion, also has qualitative and quantitative that cannot be questioned. So the data that cannot be questioned. That said, are you optimistic that change will occur?
Okay, so thank you for that nice comment, to the person who said that nice comment. So I'm always an optimist, and I wouldn't have written the book if I weren't an optimist. I will say that I was a little disheartened when I, like, you know, I just want to read a quote to all of you. Okay, I'm just going to read this quote. Okay, says, this is from a university dean, one of the AAU university or academic deans, and he says, I think we've been really focused on hiring from the Ivies. We've got to get the thoroughbred, and that has also precluded us from looking more broadly at candidates in terms of race, ethnicity, and other aspects of diversity. Now, there is some talk of extending beyond, but I'll wait to see how much the departments actually will end up doing it, because we all want to be like Harvard. And I will tell you that that for me was incredibly disheartening, because there were a lot of comments like that. Okay, the obsession with Harvard, being like Harvard. I mean, everybody just talked about Harvard, right? So, but when in the call to action, I decided to end it on a upbeat and, hey, you can do it, right? So for me, there shouldn't be any excuses. I mean, first of all, there are already lots of people who have written guides, and I'll just mention Daryl Smith's work again, because it's you know, really exemplary work, where she has talked about this extensively, and also retention issues. So there's lots and lots of work out there. But I think for me, I am hopeful a couple of things. Number one, I've had some pretty good sales, so that's good, right? Number two, I've had a lot of people reach out. I've had people reach out asking specifically for, hey, do you have practical solutions in this book? And I'm like, yes, I have so many practical things. And I think the beauty of the book, my favorite thing about the book, is all of the voices of people who are in the trenches doing this work. You know, Mari, I'm not sure if you know, but like, I literally poured my soul into this book. And so I just like, I
feel it and see it.
I poured my soul into it. And I think that, yeah, I am hopeful. I think it'll take some kicking and screaming. I really do. I mean, I have seen things on search committees that I would rather never see. And part of that, I think, is fear. Part of it is just, again, that laziness. I think part of it is just not truly believing that people of color are of the same quality. And I'm going to say it because I've heard people say it. I have literally heard people say, when you'll start talking about diversity, and the first thing out of their mouth, and these are people who are, you know, super liberal and everything, the first thing out of their mouth is, well, diversity is important, but we got to remember quality, right? There is no reason why in a conversation of about diversity, you ever need to bring up quality. In fact, that's racist. That's a racist thing to do. And so I think if people are willing to do the work, and they're willing to step up, and they're willing to explain things and have conversations with people, and maybe give up a little bit, I think we can do it. I definitely think it's possible. I'm very proud that, you know, I work in a school of education that is taking that really seriously. But part of that is I have an African-American woman dean who takes it very seriously and doesn't allow for excuses, and brings it up in all aspects of her role, and make sure that she's spreading this out all over the place, and doesn't put up with the excuse of, well, I don't know.
Yeah, and again, it's that intentionality that makes a big difference, and the commitment to it, and the values that it brings. Someone asked a question that I think connected to what you were also describing right now in your response, was that there has been a faster growth in international faculty hiring, and that, and in some ways, that is also where some of the aspects of diversity is coming to play. So what are we doing to manage this, or why the difference with regards to international faculty as opposed to underrepresented minority faculty in the United States?
Okay, so this is one of the big surprises for me in doing this work. I was not I really wasn't prepared for what I ended up finding. And what I ended up finding is that where the folks who are, international faculty are doing extremely well, better than African Americans, better than the Latinx population, of course, better than Pacific Islanders, of course, better than Native Americans. They are doing very, very well. They're also doing very well among AAU PhD recipients. So, and I think it's really important that we have an incredibly diverse faculty, but I also think it's really important that we realize that we are falling short in huge ways with Black and brown faculty who are, U.S. Citizens, right? We're really falling short. And so that was one of the things that I found, is that they are overrepresented in terms of the faculty. And that's something we probably need to talk about. That's where the growth is. The growth is in international faculty.
Yeah, and we're seeing that across the board. And yet, a lot of faculty that are coming from abroad sometimes deal with these issues of systemic racism. Many of them actually do. And so they're also aware of how their own, country of origins, institutions, and so forth. And so I have found them also very well versed and willing to engage in these conversations here as well. And at the same time, also wanting to challenge the reality of the context that we're facing here in the US in terms of particularly African Americans and US Latinx faculty, and also Native faculty not being hired at the same rates as other folks as well. Another question that someone posed, there's a question with regards to staff hiring. And I know this is not what the book you wrote about staff hiring, but I thought it was a great question related to what do we do about that, and how does that impact? Because that impacts institutions, academic departments, all those things are connected. So I think that that's something to sort of think about in that larger context. But relatedly, they also asked the second part with regards to, in their home institution, they hear that faculty are overworked and are overwhelmed with many of the things that they have to do from the upper administration and with regards to running departments and so forth, and hiring practices. And so what changes need to happen at the even higher level, like central administration, maybe board of trustees, in order to address the ability for faculty to get equipped to address these issues, for departments to be ready to engage in these intentional and really important conversations. You mentioned earlier at the beginning as well, in terms of, sort of tenure, promotion expectations and so forth. What has to change then to be able to give also the faculty the space to be able to address this in ways that really can have an impact?
So again, this is going to be a little bit unpopular, okay? And I'm speaking to white faculty right now. You've had enough space. That's how I feel about it. I feel like white faculty have had enough space that they need to do this work, okay? I think faculty are always talking about how important shared governance is and how important their voices are. This is an area where you can have an amazing voice. So now we're talking to faculty of color, we know from research, do more research, do more service, especially women of color. Women in general do, but women of color especially. So I do think that leaders need to acknowledge that and make sure that women of color and folks who are doing high levels of service are compensated for that. When it goes above and beyond, I think we need to compensate people for that, be it summer money, be it research fund money. I think that's really important. I will say that I think part of your job as a faculty member is, like, one of your most important jobs as a faculty member is hiring other faculty. And I guess for me, I think that's part of it. There's lots that leaders can do, but faculty need to step up. We're the ones who are really responsible for sort of reinforcing systemic racism.
Yeah, and I think that one of the issues with that is that at the end of the day, the faculty governance that you mentioned, that's such a big part of how institutions are run and how departments ultimately even make those decisions about what are the areas that we're going to hire in. what are the fields that we
Mhm.
need, that we need faculty to teach courses and do research and so forth. And so ultimately, it's really going to be at that level. And at the same time, I think that leaders can make a commitment to saying this will be important in tenure and promotion. This will be important, as you mentioned, in
Right.
the way that deans are evaluated. This will be
Right.
important in the way in which we give resources to departments and colleges. And so then it becomes this two-way street where
Yeah.
there's a commitment on both ends to really making it happen. And so they're wonderful. I just wanted to note, Marybeth, that lots of folks are commenting how they're appreciating so much the talk, and so happy that you're not only produced and published this book and it's out there in the world and making an intervention, but also the opportunity to be here together to really talk about this, as well. And so the last thing that I wanted to ask a question is that one question here says, I often hear faculty ask what the bar is for increasing racial diversity, as in what is the level of diversity they should be aiming for? Well, how do you respond to these kinds of questions in terms of what is it that we're ultimately the end game? What is it that we're working towards? What is it that we want to see with regards to faculty diversity?
I mean, I think I wouldn't have like a hard and fast rule on this, but I think it's important that we have representation that represents, the nation and the student body and just like, and that we have a whole diversity of opinions and perspectives from a whole variety of perspectives. I believe in academic freedom. I'm all about, having a whole variety of perspectives, but at the end of the day, race is a huge issue that we try to sort of cover up, and we're not willing to face the fact that we just haven't done the work here. And so I would say I think we know when we're looking around and it's a diverse group of people. We know when we're being representative. We know when we're shutting voices out. And so, I mean, it's sort of something that you're going to have to learn how to feel. And that's the way that I would think about it. I just think, for years and years and years, we've been hiring white person after white person after white person after white person. And I think we're going to have to hire a lot of people of color to sort of balance things out.
Thank you so much, Marybeth. This is we can go on for like a couple more hours in terms of conversation, discussion, but I did want to turn it over to Suzanne since we are nearing our time together. So thank you. I loved engaging with you in this dialogue, and I look forward to more conversations as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marybeth and Mari. That was a fascinating discussion. So many things on my mind, but I was especially struck, I think, by the way that you really talked about this as a shared responsibility. It's not just about the search committee. It's not just about the dean or the provost. It's really about the institution coming together as a whole. And so thank you. Really a lot of learning here happening tonight. And as David said in the chat, we hope that you will continue to participate in the dialogue through Gather. Again, for those interested in purchasing a copy of Marybeth's book, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. And again, as a reminder, there are a limited number of signed copies to those who have fast fingers and can get there quickly. If you haven't already done so, again, please share your thoughts on tonight's conversation, or if you have a question, I know there were tons of questions that we may not have been able to fully address. Please go to that chat space and to that Gather space and continue the dialogue. I think that Marybeth may be able to have even a chance to weigh in at some point. So that's another way to stay connected. We hope to see you at our next event. It's next month, Wednesday, September 28th, featuring Van Ton Quinlivan, CEO of Futuro Health and former Vice Chancellor of at a California Community College system. Van will be in conversation with Mitchell Stevens, sociologist and professor at Stanford Graduate School of Education. Van's book, Workforce RX, Agile and Inclusive Strategies for Employers, Educators, and Workers in Unsettled Times, offers a set of prescriptions for connecting workers, educational opportunities, and employment that could help to close the economic divide. Your feedback is important to us. Please let us know what you thought about tonight's presentation and fill out the post-event survey. So thank you all for attending, and good night.